Remember the Alamo by Cynthia McCarthy. Chapter 5, Davy Crockett. Pa said that the Alamo had been built a long time ago. It was built by missionaries. You can see that word is bolded, and if you remember, the bolded words have their meaning stated in the glossary at the back. Missionary is a person who goes to a foreign land to teach religion to the native people. Remember, we learned about the missions. They called it the Alamo because it was built in a grove of cottonwood trees. Even though I may not know what grove means, there's a picture right here. Alamo is the Spanish word for cottonwood. A thick stone wall ran all around the Alamo. Inside was a long yard or plaza. The missionaries had put up several buildings inside the plaza. Most of them had crumbled into ruins, but the convent was still standing, and that was where the missionaries had lived. Again, plaza is bolded, so I'm just going to check the glossary to see the meaning. It is a public square or garden. The soldiers had turned the convent into a barracks. That's where the soldiers slept, and they called it the Long Barrack. They made the second floor of the Long Barracks into a hospital. Again, barracks is bolded, so I'm going to check again. What is barracks? Lodging for soldiers, where they slept at night. So this was a diagram of the Alamo. As you can see, there's walls all around. Here's where the church is, or the chapel, and then here are the buildings that were used by the Native Americans and the missionaries, but now are being used by the soldiers. You can see that it was a great place to stay in to protect themselves from the advancing army of Santa Anna. There were about 175 men at the Alamo. Many of them had come with Buck Travis or Jim Bowie, but 32 of them had come on their own, and they were men like Pa. Some of the men at the Alamo had lived far away once. They had moved from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts to Texas. Not all the Texans in the Alamo were American. Some were Mexicans who thought Santa Anna was a bad leader. They wanted to fight against him too. One of these men was Gregorio Esparza, and he had brought his wife and 4 children with him. Almaron Dickinson was a blacksmith, and he had moved from Tennessee to Gonzales, Texas. He had come with his wife Susanna, and they had brought their daughter Elizabeth Angelina. Everyone called her Angelina, and she was 15 months old. Susanna and I became friends right away, and I helped her take care of little Angelina. And here's a real picture of Susanna Dickinson, a photograph. There were several other women at the Alamo. They were sisters or wives of soldiers. The women and children stayed together in the chapel, and we fixed food for the men. And the meals weren't fancy, but mostly we just ate tortillas and dried beans. And if you go back to the diagram, they've labeled the church, and I'm assuming that's the chapel. Chapel and church are words that mean more or less the same thing. So it looks like the women and children stayed here, and the soldiers stayed here. I told Susanna how frightened I was of Santa Anna. I was also afraid of the big army he was leading to San Antonio. I'm frightened too, she said, but we can't let it show. We have to help the men. We have to keep their courage up. I'll try to be brave, Susanna, I told her, but I knew it was going to be hard. On February 8th, Davy Crockett arrived at the Alamo. Mr. Crockett was the most famous frontiersman in the country. He had been a scout and a bear hunter, and he had also been a congressman from Tennessee for 3 terms. He was happy to hear that Pa, the Dickinsons, and I were from Tennessee, and he shook our hands. I'm sure glad to meet you, he said. Mr. Crockett loved to tell stories, tall tales he called them. He was fun to listen to. He was fun to look at, too. He wore clothes made of buckskin. He wore a coonskin cap and the tail hung down his back. He had named his rifle Old Betsy. So a coonskin cap is made from raccoon, and buckskin is animal skin. We had a big party to welcome Mr. Crockett to the Alamo. He spoke to the crowd. He told us that he had come to Texas to help us fight for our liberty. Liberty means freedom. He'd brought 14 men with him. So this is a picture of a book, the front cover of a book that was written about Davy Crockett, most likely after he had died. None of Mr. Crockett's men owned any land in Texas, but they'd come to the Alamo. They would help us fight for our rights against Santa Anna. Mr. Crockett and his men gave me new courage. Pa felt the same way. "I'm sure glad Davy Crockett is with us," Pa said. "He's a good man to have on your side in a fight." And look at this picture. It's a picture of Texas, and these are the boundaries back then, and that's what they were fighting for. They were hoping that Texas would become its own state within Mexico or its own country at that time.